Once again, good morning. At least it's morning here in Chicagoland, and a very grim and gloomy morning it is. Hopefully that'll change by midday. It is Wednesday, March 23rd, 2022. Today, I'm very, very pleased to announce a guest we have joining us, and I'm going to, moving forward, periodically host episodes that I think of as mind phaser extras. That focus on individual persons in our movement and within our milieu of people with common goals and basic shared affinities in terms of political orientation and cultural interests. And today, on this maiden voyage of Mind Phaser Extra, we've got a dear friend of mine. And a man who's really doing God's work, in my opinion, for our movement, as well as just for dissident intellectual thought on its own terms in a value neutral way, if such things ever could be said to be value neutral. Who we've got on deck with us today is Mike from Imperium Press. I'm sure many of you are well aware of Imperium Press. They, in fact, publish my own science fiction brand, Steel Storm, and I cannot adequately express how grateful I am for that. I'm not just being courteous, and I'm not somehow being obsequious, because I enjoy Mike's work product that he himself produces as a content creator, as well as his business savvy that has allowed Imperium to become a flagship brand within our movement. But I can say that the reception of Imperium has exceeded all expectations, and I'm incredibly honored by that. But in large part, I owe a lot of that to Mike and his willingness to take a risk on authors that he has confidence in and who he believes bring something of objective merit to the table. And that's being an independent publisher is never easy, and sometimes it's quite literally thankless. But Mike's always been a gentleman in that regard. He's always exhibited a tremendous business aptitude, and he's always done right by his clients, and zealously promoting their work product and treating them with a great deal of dignity and respect. So, with that said, I want to turn it over to Mike here. I want to tell us, Mike. Tell us a bit, who is Mike at Imperium, and tell us, what is Imperium Press? I mean, a lot of the subs, as I indicated, are well familiar with Imperium, the brand. But, I mean, those who aren't, maybe tell them a little bit about it and what you do, and tell everybody as much as you're comfortable with. Tell us about Mike. Who is Mike? How did he get involved in publishing, and how did he come to the dissident right?
Well, thank you very much, Thomas, for having me on. First of all, I just want to say that you're a real asset to us and an asset to the broader movement. So we are honored to be working with you. I think we work well together. I think what we're doing in Imperium Press and what you're doing with your brand and everything you're doing, it complements. We complement each other well. So as far as who I am, well, I am an old musician. Not that old, but that's what I used to do anyway. When I was, a few years back, I had no plans to get into publishing. I was actually, working musician, and then eventually I became a music producer. And you can imagine working with musicians, what someone with my proclivities and tendencies, my political leanings. You can imagine what that was like.
Indeed.
But I mean, I shouldn't counter-signal it too much because I was very choosy. I didn't get very big because I limited my client pool to basically only people that I liked, working with people whose music I liked and who didn't make me want to strangle them. So that really limited my clientele. All the guys I used to work with were awesome. But anyway, yeah, I used to be a musician. That was my thing. I come out of a sort of creative arts background. That makes it sound a lot more sort of like prep school than it was. I was a musician in the punk scene, metal. That was basically my thing. Yeah. So anyway, that's kind of my background anyway. So
Yep.
And then I was in Canada. That's where I was from, playing music there. Eventually decided that I had to leave the city that I was living in because it was one of the most costly cities in the world. And thought, well, what's the next logical move for me? Well, it's obviously to move all the way across the globe and settle in a remote part of Australia. So, yeah, it was just a bunch of contingencies that sort of pushed me in that direction. And when I got here to Australia, I hadn't have a friend in the world. I mean,
Right.
yeah. So, except for my family, which came with me. So anyway, that kind of actually started me tacking in another direction. So I didn't have all my music friends and contacts and scene and everything. So I started, I got into the most radicalizing platform that you could imagine. I jumped on Reddit and I started debating fucking communists
Right.
and
Right.
basically shitting down their throat. It was, jumping into that. It's like, you're jumping into the real, that's the viper's den, right? Like
Yeah. That's really, yeah. Yeah. It's
that's
not
where
just some
everybody is.
generic
So,
read. Yeah.
I got radicalized by Reddit, just basically by going in there. And, at the time I was a libertarian. And of course,
Sure.
Reddit is still hostile territory for a libertarian.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, getting in there and getting on the anarcho-capitalist sub and on some of the debate subreddits and forums and everything like that, there was plenty of communists to debate. And that's where I kind of cut my teeth as far as refining my worldview. And it was a really good thing I did because I ended up having to actually defend my libertarian views and eventually found that I couldn't do it. I remember the particular debate that I got in was basically about, is taxation theft?
Uh-huh.
And I'm on the pro side at this point. And of course, in order to argue this case, you have to have a concept of property. And the concept of property that I had basically fell apart because it wasn't sound. So libertarianism, for the most part, I think I like to think of it as a theory of property rights that sort of masquerades as a political philosophy and a moral philosophy. Basically, what it comes down to is the conception of property is kind of at the heart of everything, which is why Murray Rothbard says that all rights are property rights, all human rights are property
Right.
rights. Anyway, not to get into a digression on libertarianism,
Oh no, no,
uh,
no. It's on point.
it pushed me away from it though. So, after that, I was sort of a little bit adrift. I didn't know, I remember this time I had a lot of cognitive dissonance basically. And, after sort of like being pushed around in these like rough seas of ideology, I kind of found my way towards neo-reaction, which is a natural move for a libertarian, I guess.
Sure.
And that basically started me towards, reading Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land and all those guys. And
Right.
one of Yarvin's big injunctions, one of his big imperatives that he hands you when you read his, I think he's a great writer, actually. Some people don't like him, but one of the things he says is read old books. That's basically like, if you take nothing else from Curtis Yarvin, that's what I took from him. Basically, what he kind of taught me is that all or almost all of the questions and debates and issues that are at play today have been hashed out and sorted out and probably explained definitively by guys like 300 or 400 years ago who knew 6 languages and were they were like ministers in the government or whatever, like somebody like a Robert Filmer. You think of somebody like that, like this is a very impressive individual if you read his writings. And somebody like a Joseph de Maistre, I mean, here's another very, very impressive individual. So as a libertarian, basically the reason why I got into libertarianism is that I certainly didn't think that I was a left, so I guess I must be right. And the right and the tradition that the sort of cookie cutter tradition that everybody knows about on the right is painted as very anti-intellectual, and the only intellectual option that I saw was libertarianism, so I naturally gravitated toward that.
No, it's a
And that,
fascinating. I want to just let me insinuate real quick that
Mhm.
point cannot be overstated. This idea that people have internalized owing to a combination of kind of social pressures and like this endless kind of canard that in academia as well as in more pop media sources, this idea that oh, the right, whether the dissident right or whether the kind of mainstream right just suffers from this kind of intellectual poverty, of not just of primary sources, but of serious postulates and theories. And that's, I mean, that's laughable on its face, but you do have to you do have to immerse yourself and deep dive in your studies to kind of understand why that is. And it does not surprise me at all that there's a lot of super smart guys, like you, who that's kind of their resume, as it were, in terms of their initial academic, immersion into these things. But go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, oh, absolutely. It's a good point, and of course, probably the most maligned as like half retarded right wing strain of thought is fascism, and nothing could be further from the truth than that. So yeah, basically, we are as as the right wing or conservatives or whatever you want to call yourself, to the right of you know Hillary Clinton or something like that, is painted as something that's anti-intellectual, and that was the attraction of libertarianism. It is very intellectual. I'm not going to say it seems. I'm not going to say it seems like it. It is actually, and it's a school of thought that I had to reckon with, and so. When I kind of got spat out the other side of it and sort of realized that the foundation of it is weak, I found neo-reaction. And here's a scene at the time. This would have been about 2014 or something like that. Here's a scene of guys who are like very, very serious about their theory, but also kind of like in a way irreverent and speaking truth to power, but in a very, very erudite way. So anyway, what I took from Yarvin, a bunch of things, but sort of the main thing, the overarching meta level critique that he offered was to say, read old books. And then I did that, and I discovered all these old authors, a Giambattista Vico and a Robert Filmer and a Joseph de Maistre and like a Thomas Carlyle, all these guys, and just
really,
discovering. And
that
that sort of like gave me license. It's like it gave me a permission slip to identify as the radical right that wasn't just this idiotic, brain dead thug thing, that this reactive, just morass of retardation like it's painted out to be. So I basically found my guys, right? And so I started reading them and everything like that, and just swallowing these texts whole and just trying to digest them, and like as quick as possible. I couldn't get enough of it. And when you're doing this, you're reading all the editions that are available, and like, let's be honest, there are not very many editions available of Joseph de Maistre or Jean Baudin or any of these guys. And I just found, long story short, without like going into the details of what was wrong with them, I just found that these editions were not up to par. Scholarship wise, translation's pretty good. The introduction, certainly whoever is writing it knows what he, knows his subject. But the problem is that these people are hostile to their subject almost always.
It's punitive. It's a punitive assault on a body of work masquerading as intellectual discourse. Yeah. I mean, that's really kind of white elephant in the room. I mean, even guys on the right who are pretty well educated. I'm not talking about in terms of the credentials they managed to collect. I mean, guys who are inclined towards real kind of deep intellectual activities. It's there. The enemies managed to cast this kind of it's managed to cast historical memory, what remains of it, as this idea that there's been this kind of inevitable march towards quote unquote progress, and there was much terrible bloodletting, and in the aftermath of the War of Three Kingdoms, and in the aftermath of the 30 Years' War previously, that culminated in the implementation of the Westphalian paradigm. But subsequently, they make it out like there's a handful of reactionaries who had an affinity for the Anshin regime, either owing to irrational kind of nostalgia for such things, or just because they coveted the power so ferociously that they once held that they were perfectly willing to kind of cobble together these sort of ersatz ideologies to critique. To critique Jacobinism, or to or to reestablish, the medieval order, where there was caste interdependence, and every man was in his proverbial place, and there was this enduring stability and things. But beyond that, there's absolutely nothing to this. There's no merit, to these philosophies, and they didn't even really have an impact. And that really is fake history. People talk about fake news. That's fake history. I mean, even if you're not inclined to the right, and even as a reactionary, or as a more kind of 20th century sort of radical partisan. Yeah, I mean, you're just if you accept what I just described, the kind of court historian view, you're not really talking about history. You're talking about this kind of you're talking about this kind of you're talking about this confabulated sort of ideological narrative that was deliberately crafted to prop up the legitimacy of the victors. I mean, all this. I just wanted to insinuate that. Forgive me for.
Yeah. Oh,
okay.
no. You're right to bring it up, because history is kind of like the ultimate enemy for liberalism, because basically what liberalism is as an ideology is kind of an institutionalized amnesia. The idea is that anything, if you think of liberalism, sort of what it is from its foundations in the revolutionary liberalism of the 18th century, moving into the sort of aristocratic liberalism of the Enlightenment, and then moving from that onto sort of like bourgeois liberalism, and then so on, all the way through mass democracy, and like everything, all the sort of iterations and developments of liberalism from, say, the French Revolution or so until today, or like the English Civil War until today. What you're finding is basically something that is hostile to everything that's embedded and concrete and organic. Anything that has a history, anything that can't be changed, or anything that is just sort of, very, very, very much concrete. So this is what liberalism hates. And of course, what's the most concrete thing? What's the most unchangeable thing of all? It's the past. So that's the one thing that has to be erased. And
also, the annihilation of prime symbols too. I mean, obviously, what's paramount is the eradication of facts, and the narratives that that surrounded those facts. In terms of the historical record. But to your point, also, the left really, when we talk about psychological warfare, I mean, we're not talking about some kind of hokey. It's not just some hokey metaphor, nor is it some kind of conspiracy theory. The left, like all political theologies, it deals very much in psychological symbols and prime symbols therein. So yeah, it's imperative not just for the past to be eradicated, so that it can, so that values can kind of just be rendered malleable, and there's not any reference points beyond the immediate present and what is postulated by people then in authority. But if you there's a reason why there's a reason why the Khmer Rouge would blow up these Buddhist temples, and there's a reason why the Taliban engage in these same kinds of antics, owing to what they claim is a need to destroy craven images. It's exactly the same phenomenon. When some communist type, or some foolish or some foolish professional agitator, on the payroll of some NGO, with a sort bankrolled by Soros, vandalizes a statue of General Lee or of Nathan Bedford Forrest. It's they want to eradicate the ability of quite literally prime symbols to animate people in any way, whether it's to move them emotionally, or to pique their curiosity, in purely intellectual terms, or if it's just as something as seeming as kind of banal as a monument representing a structure that one associates with his hometown, where he feels that he belongs. This is very much a modality of psychological terrorism, if not warfare. You're absolutely right. Go ahead.
Oh,
Mike.
it is a kind of warfare. Absolutely. It's what's sort of coming to be known as fifth generation warfare, which involves things like economic warfare and cyber warfare. But most importantly, it's informational warfare, right? So like when the enemy starts yelling about disinformation, this is not just them trying to get hold of Wikipedia, it's them
Right.
waging war against you. They're not being hysterical. This is their form of waging war. So like each of the different generations from first all the way to fifth, you think of like line and column in the first generation, and then from there after that you get sort of like second generation is more like like tactical kind of warfare, and then third generation is, and it just goes on and on like that. And basically what it does is the first generation or the second generation sort of renders obsolete the first, and then the third renders obsolete the second, and so on and so on. Well, the fourth generation of warfare is basically guerrilla warfare, where
Yeah.
the line between friend and enemy is completely erased. And you think of something like Vietnam. Um, and what is it that can subvert that? Because, like the US just lost a war in Afghanistan, a prolonged war, prolonged fourth generation war against these people because it's so effective. Well, how can they subvert that? The only way to subvert that is by basically making it so that it sort of like interrupts your ability to form alliances in the first place. And one of the ways that they do that is making you believe that you're not a coherent people, right? And this is kind
Right.
of like, where I'm going with this is to touch on what you said about prime symbols, like, the monuments and of General Lee and all of these, the statues and everything that, represents a historical reality of what America is or what Canada is or what your country is, has to be erased, right? This is part of the informational warfare, where probably the strongest form, let's just say the weakest form of identity is something like a propositional identity. Everybody believes the same thing. Everybody subscribes to the idea of what it is to be an American, right? The
Yep.
proposition nation. And then what's even stronger than that is something like the imperative. If you could give it a name, you might call it the imperative nation, where we all follow the same commands, where we're all bound by a sort of like cultic center. And I mean this in a sort of like the Roman state cult rather than
Oh no,
Jonestown.
yeah, no, I realize you're speaking very plainly. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
what's even stronger than that is the ostensive. And this is something like pointing to a man and saying, that's our founder, right? Nobody can take that away from you. Nobody can subvert that. There's no way to critique what George Washington is as a man, or General Lee as, here's the guy, right? Like nobody can say that's not the guy. I mean, that's the center, sort of centripetal force around which people gather, right? And that's
Right.
the strongest form of identity. The only way to subvert that is to destroy that symbol. So that's what they're doing. This is part of the fifth generation warfare that I'm talking about here. And to kind of circle back to sort of close off the introduction of who I am and what Imperium Press is, basically what we're trying to do as an organization, as a publisher, is uh, to excavate and revive these figures in the past, to give the radical right a tradition, to give us something to look back on, something to be proud of, because we have a lot to be proud of. Our intellectual history is second to none. Basically, the reactionary, the traditionalist, is the one that is the culture bearer.
Yeah, the
So
stewards of it.
that's what we're trying to do, and I think that's the reason why Imperium Press has been chased off of Twitter and deplatformed here and there, is because these people are not stupid. Our enemies can see that this is kind of we're over the target basically, and they're afraid of us. If not sort of tooting my own horn too much, they
No,
don't like
no,
what we're up
that
to.
yeah, that's appropriate. I wanted to ask you, and it's I'm not digressing because it's very much on point to what we're discussing. Are you familiar with? Did you remember? I mean, he's still alive, but I mean, he hasn't been particularly active in recent years. From what I've noticed. Do you recall Troy Southgate? He was a guy who was involved in the political soldier faction of the British National Front. Then he became a publisher. Does that name ring a bell or no?
The name's definitely familiar, but I don't know much about him.
Okay, yeah, he's maintained a low profile lately. He's something of an eccentric guy. I don't mean that negatively, and I'm not saying that to suggest he's some kind of silly individual. Like quite the contrary. Very very serious guy. Very tough guy. Too frankly, not just some bookish academic. But one of the last projects that I knew of his direct involvement was, and this was long before Frog Twitter. This was long before Gab, and free speech platforms emerged as a competitor to things like Twitter. Southgate, so he published a series of paperbacks, like a volume oriented series, like one, and each one would profile a man. Most of them were 20th century figures, but there were some 19th century figures and some even preceding, some of the counter revolutionary figures like the Meister himself. But he was essentially trying to create a cultural library, figuratively and literally, of the right. He had one volume dedicated to Mishima. He had one volume dedicated to Oswald Mosley. He had one dedicated to Dollfuss, who which is interesting. I mean, a lot of people who were sympathetic to the German Reich don't have any use for Dollfuss. I mean, even that he was murdered by National Socialists, but Dollfuss was a big social credit kind of Catholic, and Austria. I think Austria was always. I mean, it always had more in common with a place like Switzerland, really, than it did, a place like the Czech Republic or something. They not only were they kind of a hub of high culture, with owing to myriad influences and things during the Habsburg era, but they also they very much were forward looking in terms of economic theory, and developing a kind of a complex interdependence in Europe that would serve European people. I'm not talking about free trade or globalism or any of those insidious things. But in any event, so there was a volume, I believe, on Dollfuss, but it was a very interesting project. Okay, and it didn't really take off because I think that the time wasn't right then, if that makes any sense. But and what Mr. Southgate was doing, he was not nearly as adept at these things than you yourself are, and some of your colleagues. But he made that point too, is that look, even if you don't have any ideological truck with the right or any affinity for it, this idea that the counter Enlightenment right, and then later the counter revolutionary right, the idea that these men were somehow anti-intellectual, or it was some kind of community of truck drivers and factory workers, who had no need for for endeavors of the mind that lacked any utility for somebody who was interested in pursuing a course of direct action to reverse the course of politics as they came to be defined in the 20th century. I mean, that's really at odds with history. And not only is it important to expose people, especially younger people who still haven't really been able to make that kind of break with the mainstream culture, the mainstream intellectual culture, I mean, and and kind of embrace self-study as the way forward in terms of their own personal development, as well as gaining an understanding of their own lives and the historical paradigm in which they like every other man and woman today is situated. So the kind of thing that Southgate was doing wasn't really going to resonate with people of the sort who I just described. But one of the things I find is so one of the things I find is I feel very much that Imperium is doing God's work, and it's not because you're my friend and because you publish my own brands and things, but people are realizing more and more, owing to the ubiquity of information, the true ubiquity of information. I mean, we're coming on 30 years now of consumer internet being something that is just part of our day-to-day existence. Regardless of class, regardless of age, regardless of geographic situation. But there's also a context that is now present, because people people can compare and contrast, what is being told to them by official sources with, what is actually underway owing to crowdsourced data, literally moment to moment. Whether it's a man on the ground with his iPhone, filming what's happening in Ukraine versus what, say the New York Times is claiming was happening there, or they're coming to see, they're finding the, they'll come across some social media account, or they'll come across, some essays by a guy who's not, an Ivy League scholar, but he's a guy who's an independent scholar and a revisionist, whose fact checking is impeccable, who's the sources that he relies upon are impeccably verified, and the reader are kind of every man who's not particularly astute on the nuances of what constitutes the current power structure. He'll come across this and be like, well, like, wait a minute, this makes a lot of sense. And the man who wrote this certainly has no interest in undermining the prevailing narrative for its own sake. He's certainly not getting rich doing this. As far as I can tell, he certainly isn't just a bigoted type who's doing this for cathartic reasons. It's become more and more impossible, for the regime to control the narrative, not just on grounds of the fact that they had, the electronic bully pulpit when television was the dominant medium and there was no such thing as crowdsourced polemic, or the ability for, literally any man or woman potentially on the street to proffer concrete evidence of lies within these narratives that are emanating from what was, as I said, the bully pulpit. Yeah. So that can't be overstated. And I think Imperium would be successful in some sense, regardless of the epoch it was situated in, just because you produce an incredibly high quality product. You're very discriminating in the authors that you run, and it's all stuff that's very, very timely while not being trendy. But I was very, very happy when you reached out to me right when I got back on social media, because, like I said, the only real iteration of what Imperium does I'd run up on before was, like I said, was Mr. Southgate's, and there's nothing wrong with what he was doing, but it just seemed the time was not right. And I realize it's kind of a tightrope. You gotta, I believe very much in a vanguardist strategy. We can't dumb down our message or our content for popular consumption, nor should be. That would be counterproductive. On the other hand, you don't want to produce things above ground, or above board rather, that are so esoteric. There's a handful of men in any, within a population of any 1,000 people who are going to respond to it. But with that,
well, thank you for that. No, that's very high praise coming from you. One of our guys pointed me towards you a couple of years ago. I didn't know who you were, and I only had to read the first 3 or 4 of your collected best of posts, greatest posts. Only had to read about 3 or 4 of those to know that I needed to reach out to you and, to get the ball rolling towards where we are today, where we've published something of yours. So, I appreciate that compliment coming from you, because it's high praise. But yeah, I think the time is right for Imperium Press. We kind of hit at the right time. I agree. I think we're doing high quality stuff, but also the time was kind of right for it. Basically, the Web 2.0 and the internet kind of had to develop to a certain point to where we can do what we're doing. I'm not sure when Mr. Southgate was publishing these things, but probably it was too early. Where at the moment now, we have access to the Internet Archive and all these old texts that have been scanned. It makes things very easily. We have optical character recognition, where we can take a PDF and turn it into text. Right. And most importantly, we've got Web 2.0, so it's the feedback loop between audience and creator. Very, very helpful. I really think that everybody loves hot takes. I don't really like hot takes. I think that what's true, the only way to account for what's real is it's always going to be a simple explanation. I think the simple explanation in the end is that the reason why the regime is crumbling today, at least in terms of its narrative control, is the internet. And this is not, I'm not telling anybody anything they don't already know, but basically the internet is completely subverted and rerouted around all of these legacy media channels to where now people can kind of get it from the horse's mouth. And another interesting aspect is sort of coming along at the same time as well. Basically, we have this insane ultra libertinism that's been going on for a long time, and in a sort of ironic way, it's kind of subverted itself, because basically what it's done is it's undermined people's disgust response. So the one thing that I remember when I got on the internet. I'm old enough to have remembered when the internet became a thing. What was the first thing I looked at when I was a kid? Way too young to be on there. I went and looked up this gore website, and I went and looked up this porn website. That was number one and number two. I think the other way around, but those were number one and number two when I got on the internet when I was like a little kid.
Sure.
So now you've got this situation where it's unfiltered. Basically, children and people of all ages are just relentlessly exposed to this barrage of just disgusting overexposure. And what does that do? It erodes your disgust response. And this has done something very interesting, because the one thing that we are all taught to feel the most revulsion towards, the one thing that is beyond the pale, no matter what your fetish is something that looks a lot like what was going on in interwar Germany. That is the one thing that you are not allowed to like. It's the one thing you have to be disgusted by. So the fact that this disgust response has been undermined and undermined and undermined for generations, I think has kind of benumbed people to the point where they're curious. They want to take a look. They want to look into the heart of darkness, and they do that, and they see that what it is not what is on the label. And this has kind of created a counter current, so to speak, no pun intended, that is kind of leading people towards what we're doing. And in fact is one of the currents that led me personally towards the radical right. Reaction and fascism and all of these things, they're a little bit sexy, they're a little bit attractive, they're a little bit dangerous, and so people are attracted to that. And now what's happening is you get this bizarre inversion, structural inversion, where the right is actually the radical side of the ledger, and the left is now the tradition. And of course, this is a very explosive kind of situation. It's not the way that things naturally should be. So it, of course, creates a situation where anything can happen. And one of the things that have come out of this kind of explosive, volcanic womb of nations, of ideologies, is our thing. And so it's a good time to be part of it. It wouldn't have been possible in 1998, or wouldn't have been possible in 2008. We had to kind of wait for that to be possible. And Imperium Press was just fortuitous enough to kind of hit at the time where that was becoming possible.
No, that's what's fascinating. I'm not drawing any comparison at all in terms of the concrete activities that you are involved in, and I am, and everybody in our thing is, versus the annex of violent political partisans. But I was reading kind of the seminal book. I cannot remember the author for the life of me. This one 1980s journalist. He wrote a book in the 90s about Robert Matthews and the high incident armed robbery team that he led. They called themselves the Order. They were these white nationalist types who robbed a Brinks truck for the take of something like $3.8 million in 1984, which I believe that's never been surpassed in terms of a strong arm robbery of a Brinks type vehicle. But in any event, they went on this kind of nationwide crime spree and there's all kinds of late Cold War sociological intrigues and dynamics here. They were convinced, like many people were, that, well, if not imminent in terms of days or months, at some point there's going to be, a nuclear war between NATO and the Pact. So it doesn't matter anyway if what we're doing now is reckless, because it won't matter when the next cycle of war, instigates. And there's a very kind of apocalyptic millenarial orientation to what these guys did. Like, they were just a bunch of yahoos, is what I'm getting at. But they were, Matthews himself and a bunch of his comrades and cohorts, they've been associated with the National Alliance and William Pierce. I mean, Pierce was pretty candid about this. He's like, they came to, his biographer, Pierce, is Robert Griffith, wrote a really interesting book on Pierce called Fame of a Dead Man's Deeds. And, Pierce he hadn't long to live at that point. And so I think you can take what he said there as credible too. And in addition, like I said, Pierce had a reputation as being very honest. But Pierce said that Matthews came to him sometime before, he undertook this kind of one man, revolutionary path. And Pierce told him, I don't think the country is in a revolutionary mood. And he said that Matthews, being kind of a young hothead and this kind of impassioned sort of radical, didn't really compute with him. But Pierce, I'm not a huge Pierce fan. I always respected him, and I think he was a brilliant guy in some ways. But I don't particularly share his politics. But whatever your activity is, if you're any kind of dissident, whether you're fully within the law as we are, whether you're a violent outsider, whatever political orientation or theology animates you, whether you're some Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine operative, or whether you're some Al Qaeda type Salafi wacko, or a Red Army faction type, or a National Socialist, it doesn't matter. The epoch in which you're situated basically decides if there's going to be any meaning to whatever direct action you take. It's that's how things are impactful. I mean, yes, obviously, a political soldier's or a terrorist or a partisan, whatever, whoever or whatever he chooses to target, and the methodology he employs in the course of that enterprise, and whether he succeeds or not at the operational level of the mission. I mean, yes, these things hold a significance too in terms of his fortunes and that of his cause. But at the bottom, at brass tacks, it's to your point. It's whether the epoch will abide any possible
it's the
impact.
zeitgeist, basically. It's the spirit of the age.
Yeah, you can't generate it out of whole cloth, like somebody rubbing a magic lamp or something, and then suddenly, or you can't conjure a zeitgeist, out of nothing, because you feel really strongly about it, or you're really, really persuasive, and everybody you talk to seems to agree with you. There's something metaphysical about this. I don't go in for mysticism, but I mean, I am a Christian, and I am a God-fearing man, and I am a right Hegelian at base. So okay, even if you don't believe in God, or even if you think metaphysics is kind of a lot of gobbledygook, you can't deny that even if what the phenomenon is just the sum result of billions of aggregate discrete decisions, ossifying into this kind of concrete whole of a phenomenon that just develops the force of a tsunami, as it were, and kind of encompasses all human activity within its paradigm, or whether it's literally the hand of God. Okay, it doesn't matter, because it is a real thing. Like, what that thing is, I mean, you can argue that a lot of ways, but you can't simply wave it off and say this is not something that happens. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, like I said, the gaze of Imperium, I don't just say this because you're my friend and because you promote my brand, which is a great honor, and I don't want to blame this too much because I don't want to sound like some shill or some just kind of obsequious, oh shucks sort of character. I would have been happy on Steel Storm if I simply didn't eat a loss, if I broke even. I can't tell you how honored I am that people consider it worthwhile enough to buy, and every week I get deluged with messages as to how much people enjoy it and want the brand to continue. And just the fact that you, Mike, were willing to take a risk on a fiction brand when that's not really what Imperium does. I mean, I can't tell you what a great honor that is, and I know I know you were already established before then. It's not like Imperium had no online presence and had no real business organization prior to you bringing me on board to publish my content. But it has grown substantially since we first met, and that's just been incredible to observe, and just what an incredible.
Well, it's a great piece of work, man. Like, you should be proud of it. It's an excellent book, and guys are clamoring for number 2. So it's there is appetite
Indeed.
for it.
And I mean, again, not to belabor it. No, the last thing I want to do is ever embarrass anybody or put them on the spot, especially not a dear friend such as yourself. But I really can't thank you enough. What do you? I want to just I want to get just a couple of your I want to get a couple of your I want to get a couple of your final thoughts. I mean, I don't mean we need to wrap this up imminently, but moving forward, do you think increasingly, like you yourself, I mean, not just in terms of business decisions that you choose to render and implement, but do you have you contemplated moving in a more kind of current events and power political analysis direction, especially owing to the world situation? I know that Imperium, I know that a lot of the guys that whose work you promote, as well as some mutual friends and acquaintances of ours, have a strong interest in Russia. I mean, just an enduring one, either because that's their heritage or their sectarian orientation, confession rather, is orthodox, or they just have a very Spenglerian view of the planet, and thus they assign a certain significance to Russia in terms of the cultural dimension of warfare and historical processes. Like, what do you have? I'm sorry to throw that huge compound question at you, but moving forward, do you envision Imperium publishing more content having to do with current events day to day, and kind of assimilating that into overall theories of political philosophy? And secondly, I mean, do you have a strong take on the Russia situation? I don't want to put you on the spot here either, but I'd very much like to hear it if you do, and I'm sure the subscribers would. I know they would.
Yeah. So as far as like the our brand and everything like that, the way we brand ourselves is as the classics department of the right. Our job, our mandate is basically to reclaim our intellectual history, and that includes, because I think that the traditionalist doesn't really see a strong distinction between past and present. I think he sees it as something that's basically continuous. So, certainly current events is not something that we ignore. I think we've got some guys kind of around the organization, related to the organization, who are very astute when it comes to that. We've got a journal published by Joel Davis called Firstness, and you see actually quite a bit of it's a wide variety of interesting stuff, and some of that is current events related material. So that's right. A good vehicle for that, and that's we publish Firstness when new issues come out. But as far as like my own stance, my own sort of thoughts about the current situation, what I like to do, what I try and do always, to kind of take a zoom out, bird's eye view, and look at these things in terms of the larger trends that are kind of the currents, the deep currents, because
you're an inductive thinker, yeah.
They really, really do matter, and this is kind of circling back a bit to what we're saying about how history is important here, because, take like the Russia situation. There's a lot to be said about this here. Russia, in terms of its history, is kind of unique. and that makes the Russia of today unique.
Very
So
true.
Russia is kind of the scene of a lot of important births in terms of its prehistory. Ukraine itself is the cradle of the Indo-Europeans.
Yep.
Smack dab in the middle of modern Russia, we find the ancient North Eurasians, which is a very ancient cultural complex that pretty much gave us all of what we now think of as civilization, as well as, you know, the Aryan phenotype. This is like this ancient
Yeah.
North Eurasian. The
Carbon
earliest gene for
hypothesis kind of
blonde
stuff,
hair
right?
comes from these people. You know, they're the grandfather culture of the Indo-Europeans, as well as quite a few other important peoples. And it's, you know, I mean, like,
Wow.
you know, it's worth giving a kind of TLDR on a bit of Russian prehistory to kind of underline how unique it is, right?
Right.
Because this helps us to look at the present. It really puts the present in a kind of frame that we can understand. So the most important, like, Indo-European migration ended up right around modern Belarus, kind of sandwiched between modern Russia and Eastern Europe. And this migration back in the Bronze Age splintered into most of the Aryan branches we know today. They became, these Western Indo-Europeans became the Germanics, the Romans, the Celts, and actually even the Iranians and the Indians as well. So
Right.
all of these cultures, all of these what would have been tribes at the time, dwelt together in Eastern Europe and Western Russia. And of course, one of the tribes that it kind of threw off of this was the Slavs, who were very, very close by relation to the Baltic peoples. I mean,
Right.
the two hate each other now,
Yeah.
but you get a little bit of, some people are not going to like this, but you get a little bit of the narcissism of small differences here. And then anyway, so you've got this Indo-European migration. You get throwing off these daughter civilizations, and then later you get invasions into what's now Russia by the Scythians and the Sarmatians. These are
Right.
Iranian peoples, and so you get these Slavs that are kind of take up their Urheimat, their homeland around what is now Russia. And these Iranian peoples come in and change the ethnic character of the Slavs in this part of the world a little bit. But where things kind of get recognizably Russian is when the Varangians invade pretty much smack dab in the middle of the Dark Ages. And by this point, the Slavs were fairly mixed, actually. You know, what we said with, like, I mean, Russia is basically an open plain with, like, no natural borders, right, except for rivers and stuff. And the Varangians were a Germanic people, probably from Sweden. So you get another ethnic element that's kind of like comes into the mix. And under the Varangian prince Rurik, we get the establishment of the Kievan Rus, right? And this is where, you know, like, the history of Russia starts to become recognizable. And this is kind of like a federation ruled over by the Rurik dynasty, encompassed the Balts, the Finns, and all kinds of Slavs and everything. And of course, then, you know, about 1000 AD, you get the adoption of Christianity. So you get, you know, another foreign element in the mix. And this, of course, eventually becomes something very much recognizably Russian. But the point that I'm driving at here is that Russia is a real melting pot of different influences. So this is one of the things that makes them kind of unique, right? They're very mixed. It's other than the Urals in East Russia, there's like no boundaries, so it's kind of highly prone to this admixture, and it looks ethnically different to the West. It's still an Aryan people, but in a sense, it's kind of more of this ancient North Eurasian than Indo-European.
Very much caught between. Very much caught between racial forces, quite literally. I'm not trying to be melodramatic, but yeah. I mean, you no, that was a brilliant capsule summry, man. Like
and that's just the prehistory, right? Like, you know.
Yeah. No, thanks for dropping that. I was hoping you'd be willing to, because that benefits me quite a bit, and the subscribers. I guarantee you that they will find that helpful.
And I mean, there's so many differences of, like, Russia. I mean, like, they're culturally isolated from the West for a long time. Remember, Russia didn't have a Renaissance or a Reformation or anything, right? It kind of went off on its own little path, right? Taking on Orthodox Christianity, so, and all these admixtures. So by the time of Peter the Great in the 17th century, Muscovite Russia had become much more Asian over time than what we consider, right? It wasn't until Peter the Great that Russia really became Western.
A Western
So
society, yeah, arguably,
it looks a little different to us. And of course, part of this Asiatic influence, this kind of like throwback to the ancient North Eurasians, from a very early time, the Russian state was very strong. In
sure was.
like I'm in a sense that goes beyond even the strong states of the absolutist age in Europe, in Western
Yeah,
Europe. I mean, there was very, very little development of the aristocracy in Russia through like their kind of feudal or
that's
like Middle
why.
Ages, right? So
Yeah,
the
I made the
state and
point
its
that
apparatus was really highly centralized.
I mean, yeah, and just in terms of prime symbols, like symbolic psychology, especially as relates to cultural, especially as relates to s- symbolic psychology as a cultural phenomenon. I made the point again that you got to look at Stalin like he was like you would almost a great Khan. You know, he's not. You can't really compare him to Hitler or Cromwell, not just because I think Hitler and Cromwell, their emergence and things and the kind of mythology that developed around both of them differed very much from that of Stalin. But you know, there wasn't a I don't you could there never would be a proper Stalin figure emerging in France or emerging in Germany or emerging even in
Right.
the UK. I mean that
Yeah.
yeah. I mean you realize all this and yeah that the point can't be overstated.
Yeah.
What do you I mean if you're comfortable dropping on us and again I don't want to feel on the spot or like you've been cross-examined, what do you before we wrap up, what do you see as the future for Russia, man? Like, I mean, I've got my own thoughts on this, and do you see Russia truly as a kind of, you know, in kind of Yakiist terms? Do you see this as really something of a garrison vanguard culturally, and in terms of Weltanschauung, that is going to be that has and is going to be able to effectively kind of quarantine itself from subversion by Western and Zionist culture distortion, or do you think that basically it's there's somewhat illusory in that it's the uh, the the American and uh, and kind of Jewish ruling elite that is slated it for destruction. Do you think that it's really and what's underway in Russia is really just kind of like an immediate stopgap effort to resist that discrete assault upon them, or do you view Russia as kind of moving forward? Very much very much an enduring kind of bastion of authentic. I mean, forgive me for using that term, but I think in context it's apropos. Do you see Russia moving forward kind of as a perennially like authentic expression of culture and political forms tailored to guarantee the posterity of that culture that for all practical purposes remains impenetrable to its enemies, and most notably its Jewish and American enemies in the West. I mean, do you think that's overly optimistic on my part? Do you think that that's you know do you think that that's accurate? Do you think it's unrealistic for other reasons? Just kind of what's Mike from Imperium's take on all that?
Well, I mean, my sort of like, the highest level take I can give you is that I think Russia is going to continue to be what it always has been, just as the West is going to continue to be what it always has been. I don't think cultures change all that much. Of course, we were at one stage, Germanic pagans, and then we became Christianized. But a lot of that is very there's a lot of continuity between all these like sort of larger, deeper currents.
Sure.
And yeah, I mean, in terms of the near future, I think the what's looks like it's moving towards is a de-dollarization, which is going to really, really cause
That's
problems
interesting.
for us in
Yeah.
the West. There's a lot of balls up in the air right now. We don't know where they're going to land, but it kind of at the moment is looking like Russia, India, and China are moving closer together, and the West is just going to have kind of like cut its own balls off. So that's it's
Right.
going to actually be very painful for us. So it's as much as we don't want NATO and the EU to win, it's going to be a bit of an issue for us. But to give you a kind of like deeper take on like the future of Russia, I mean, I don't know if we have time for it, but I've got an idea of like a sort of like political framework that kind of transcends left and right, that like helps us to understand things. So it's basically it's like you think of left, right, and liberal, conservative, and all that. And these are like kind of low resolution categories. They're better and worse conceptual schemes that you can use. Left and right's not that useful. Illiberal and liberal is a little bit better, and some of them are actually pretty incisive. They take something like Nietzsche's Apollonian Dionysiac dichotomy. I think they don't map neatly onto left and right. But for my money, the best and most useful category is one that's developed by Georges Dumézil, and he called it the magician king jurist-priest schema. But I like to think of it as kind of Odinic and Tyrrhic.
That's
and without going too deeply into like the Indo-European theology, because remember, we are all Indo-European cultures. Russia, the West, Mediterranean cultures, all of the sort of like all the players in the current geopolitical situation, Indo-Europeans, right? Anyway, so you've got this like Odinic and Tyrrhic kind of poles, and these two, like Odin and Tyr, and these are Germanic gods, are something like the great man on the one side and the bringer of order on the other side. So Tyr is the god of justice and oaths and covenants and like the formal treaty sense of war. He's the jurist priest. He's the one that brings order. And Odin is the god of frenzy and magic and power and night and everything like that. He's the great man. He's the magician king. So the first thing I think that's important about this dichotomy is that they're not opposites; they're complements, right? Like, the great man could bring order, or vice versa. What they are is they're two actually constituents of the sovereign function. And like, why does this matter anyway? Why am I even talking about this? How does it help us? Well, I think it kind of carves reality at the joints better than sort of looking at things in terms of like left, right, based, cringe, woke, not woke. I think it kind of helps us a little bit more than that, because there's a relationship between these two it's not just oppositional, right? And the TLDR on that is that the Odinic and the Tyrrhic side of the coin are both co-sovereigns, but the Odinic prevails over the Tyrrhic. The great man prevails over the ordering principle. So to give you a kind of concrete example, and you'll understand this well because it's in your wheelhouse. Take the distinction between legal realism and legal formalism. For the audience, legal formalism is the idea that legal realism is the idea that the law is like a living body that evolves, and legal interpretations are like subject to the will of the judge and everything. Like, there's a famous quote: "All law is case law. The law constantly undergoes reinterpretation." That's legal realism. And legal formalism is like Justice Scalia, right? The idea that the law is something kind of self-evident and formal. It's like the originalist strain, right? And what American legal history is, if you kind of look at it at the highest level, it's the history of the realist as the creator and the formalist as the maintainer, right? The realist and the formalist of one generation kind of fight it out. The realist always wins, and the formalist of the next generation kind of approves the realist's creation with the stamp of traditional legitimacy. The realist is the Odinic figure. He looks kind of like a disordering and frenzied lawgiver. And then the formalist is the Tyrrhic figure. His function is to kind of like sanctify and order the creative power that's wielded by the realist, right? And you can see the same dynamic in like red state, blue state politics as well, that transcends left and right a bit.
Oh, yeah.
It gets a bit complicated, obviously, because the legal profession is itself ordering and, anyway. And this kind of also explains why National Socialism is so feared, right? Because America is now essentially a kind of like, it basically, because it's being ruled over by its judiciary to a great extent, it's kind of a Tyrrhic juggernaut. It's kind of like a jurist-priest juggernaut, right?
Yeah.
And what Hitler himself is, he is the great man par excellence. National Socialism represents everything Odinic. It's a true magician king worldview. It's particularistic. It's indigenous. It's dark. It's powerful. It's originary. Kind of like the Odinic figure himself, right? Like, it comes from Germany. It's a liminal space between East and West and all this. So anyway, I mean, like, I'm sorry to kind of digress a bit. How does this help us with Russia? The point of bringing this up with Russia is to say that the Russians Russians are very well balanced between these two Odinic and Tyrrhic poles, these two great man and ordering principles. So like compare the Russians to the Germans. The
Sure.
Germans are highly unbalanced and lean very strongly towards the Odinic. And you don't even have to think of like, I mean, definitely don't think of like modern neutered Germany, or even although even in their kind of beaten dog state, they still kind of like lean away from the juris priest. Like they don't have any desire to sanctify or endorse any part of their history. Um, think of historical Germany, like even like before the 20th century. You'll see what I mean about the kind of explosive sovereign function of the German. Even like German religions are religious figures are Odinic, and religion is usually a kind of Tyrrhic thing, usually a kind of
Very much
ordering
so.
thing.
Yeah,
So
from
think of a
Meister
Calvin
Eckhart.
or a Luther, right? Like
Yeah,
think
or
of
Meister Eckhart. Yeah, yeah.
Yep, exactly. These are like these thundering Protestant figures that come screaming out of the north. They're like they're as extreme and uncompromising as any berserker, right? And to say nothing of a Cromwell, right? And then think that like since the Germanic kind of like has the Germanic has kind of had this sovereign place over Europe for half a millennium, right? It's the Northwest Europeans that have basically been the prime movers in history for 500 years or so now, since the
Oh yeah.
Reformation, basically. And in fact, part of the reason why the Slav is like kind of rising again is because his natural predator, the German, has kind of been eliminated, right? And so anyway, that's the Odinic side. That's us. That's the Northwestern Europeans. We are that, right? And then by contrast, take the Romans, who are kind of like unbalanced in the opposite direction. Like the classical
Right.
Roman was so traditionalist that the center of his epistemology was this thing he called the mos maiorum, the idea that a thing is right because his ancestors had done it, and like for no other reason.
And
Like
yeah, and a fixation on formalism. Kind of
yeah,
like yeah,
exactly. This is why the Romans were so shitty at philosophy, right? And
yeah,
even like later with the development of the Roman Catholic Church, it still kind of hung on to many of like most of the old rituals and forms, despite being so like ideologically hostile to paganism. On an orthopraxic level, I mean, it not that much really changed. Like a lot of the rituals were very similar, but take Russia as a very balanced. It's somewhere in between. It's very balanced between these creative and maintaining elements. So one of the epithets that like the Russians used for their czars, they had two of them. One was Grozny, which means strong and fearsome, and the other
uh-huh.
is Tishaishi, meaning quiet and pious, right? And these are quite straightforwardly Odinic and Tyrrhic, respectively. And
Wow, yeah,
each of these epithets were applied to like many different czars, like, and none of them really kind of predominates. You've got like a Peter the Great. He's a true Grozny Odinic figure. He's a
right,
realist and modernizing and crude and loves violence and everything. But
yeah,
also he is the father of Russia. This is just to say that the Odinic is the sovereign, the one that
right,
prevails. And then you've got like a Tsar Alexei, right? Like his father, a very juris priest kind of like ordering Tishaishi Tsar, right? He presided over the schism in the Orthodox Church, which is kind of like a restoration of the liturgy to make it better conform with the Greek originals. So even like his reforms were traditionalist, right? Like those are the two kind of polar opposites in terms of like the Russian soul. And then you've got a Stalin later coming to the sort of modern era. You've got Stalin. He's a magician king, right? He's an Odinic figure. I mean, it's pretty obvious. He's a very Grozny kind of like Russian ruler, and he really does resemble Peter the Great in a lot of his
yes,
personality. In some sense, he's also the father of modern Russia. And then now come to today. We come to Putin, right? And Putin is a much more muted and moderate kind of Odinic figure. He's
yes,
still Grozny. He's still very strong. So from our perspective, from the radical right perspective, we can see that he's a moderate, right? The New York
definitely.
Times can't. So it's the bottom line. It's important for us to kind of like frame it in these kinds of terms. It helps us to kind of explain Russia past and present, and it also kind of helps us to understand the relationship of Russia to the West, right? Like as I mentioned
Uh,
before, the West
no,
is
indeed.
unbalanced.
Yeah, no, indeed. That was a brilliant take, man. I'm not just being polite. I take my hat off to you. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd relay to us, because you got a great talent for distilling down extraordinarily concept subjects and conceptual paradigms and rendering them intelligible without without requiring hours upon hours to do so. I am going to have to wrap this up, and I wish I didn't. I've got to get on with the day. But I know owing to the demands of life, familial and professional, you're going to be away for some time, Mike. But if you would come back for a Mind Phaser episode, or maybe we could even have Joel on too. He's appeared before. I mean, that would be dope, man. And if you're at all interested in that, I'd really love it if you'd be willing to participate. Is that something you'd be interested in?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, this has been a pleasure, man. I really appreciate
No,
you
I
having me
can't
on.
thank you enough, man. Yeah. And why don't you why don't you tell everybody? Why don't you tell the subs where they can locate Mike's own work product, as well as where they can locate Imperium Press titles that they might want to order and purchase.
Yeah, thank you very much. As you've complimented me before about being a great businessman, but I forgot to plug myself. So here's my chance. Yeah, the guys can find us at imperiumpress.org. That's the one-stop shop. You can get all our books. There's links to our podcast. Joel Davis and I do a regular podcast called the Imperium Cast. You can find that linked there as well. And all of our books and everything like that. You can find links to our social media, which is mostly manned by myself. So if you like my idiotic takes, you can find more of them through the social media links and everything like that. If you like our books, one of the best things you can do is just to subscribe to our mailing list, because of course, the powers that be want to deplatform us and everything. And I've heard tell that maybe Telegram, it looks like it's going away in Brazil, like they're banning it in Brazil. So you never know what's going to happen in the West and everything like that. So good old email list is a great way to follow us, and we don't spam. We just send out one email every time we have a book come out. That's it. So that's the place to find us, basically.
No, indeed. And again, I can't. People who know me know that I'm pretty discriminating in the content that I consume and endorse. Not because I'm some kind of snob or something, but because there's a glut of not so great stuff out there, and there's always precious little that's truly valuable and worthwhile. And yeah, I cannot praise Mike's own work product highly enough. And I cannot praise Imperium Press effusively enough for the kindness and generosity they've extended to me, and their willingness, to take a risk on my fiction brand in particular before it was clear that it would be at all profitable or even wouldn't constitute a loss. But again, I got great love for you, Mike, as you know, because you're a dear friend and comrade. And when you return, I very, very much would like to have you appear on a panel with Joel, and we can deep dive more into Russia and Indo-European cultural origins. Make it kind of a deep dive show of cultural and racial anthropology and the implications for politics of the present day. And I know that that's the kind of thing that not only do you and Joel excel at, but it tends to pique your interest and enthusiasm just as it does mine.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I'd be absolutely thrilled to come back and do that. I think that would be a great time. And thank you once again for taking a chance on us. The Steel Storm book is absolutely blown up, and I'm sure everyone in your audience has read it. So there's no need to plug it here because we're among friends and everything like that. But it's great. As soon as I read it, I was enthralled with it. So I appreciate you taking a chance on us as well. And thank you for having me on the podcast. It's been a true pleasure.
Yeah, indeed, man. Indeed. It's been great. And I want, listeners at home, even though he's been conspicuously silent, I want everybody to give love and props to the kid Ace for making this recording happen and running around bright and early in the morning his time to make sure everything went off without a hitch. So
Thank
just
you for that,
keep
Ace.
it in mind.
I think it was me that was kind of leading the charge on the time that this was happening. So I appreciate.
That's okay.
I didn't mean to put you getting up at 3 a.m. or something like
Oh
that.
no. I'm always
Appreciate
glad
that.
to do it, man. Like sincerely, I'm more than happy to do it. It's never a bother. And Ace is the best sound production man I could ask for, in addition to being a great friend. But he if it were not for him, like more often than not, I'd be foobar with this stuff. So just give him a lot of love next time you cross his path, figuratively or literally, in these environs of ours. And yeah, all right, cool people. Thanks again as always for tuning in, and we will lay audio again probably in right about a week for the regular Mind Phaser program. Stay up, be good, and as always, I got love for you.